Hello, friends. This is Gabriel. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. In this episode, it's just me. I'm going to be speaking about an element of my research on the Quran and the Bible, namely the biblical turns of phrase in the Quran. I'll be introducing 10 biblical turns of phrase that are found in the Quran. I'll be making a few arguments about them in what they show us about the emergence of the Quran and its engagement with the biblical tradition. But if you want to hear my arguments, you have to listen to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to get started on the 10 biblical turns of phrase in the Quran that I'd like to share with you. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many more. And I'm going to start by just introducing what I mean by turns of phrase, biblical turns of phrase in the Quran. I do not mean longer biblical flavored passages in the Quran, for example, stories of Abraham or Noah or Moses or otherwise. I also do not mean simply biblical vocabulary. I mean something in the middle, short turns of phrase, which are clear enough in that they have a biblical origin, but which are not actual citations or quotations of a biblical verse. And hopefully the examples will show further what I mean. I'm going to start with this quotation here that you can see from an early Orientalist by the name of Hirschfeld. This is in a book he wrote. A lot of his writing was in German, but happily for us English speakers, at least, he wrote this book in English, New Researches into the Composition and Exegesis of the Quran. Of course, they were new in 1902 when he wrote the book. And he writes from several almost literal quotations from the Old Testament and the Quran. The question arose whether an Arabic translation of the former existed in Arabia. And he goes on to say that if there were, in fact, an Arabic translation of the Bible, then Muhammad would have sought one out. He would have procured one and quoted from it accurately. But because the Quran does not quote accurately or verbatim from the Bible, we can infer from Hirschfeld's point of view, look at the end of the quotation here, that Muhammad gained the bulk of his biblical knowledge from intercourse with the people. Well, a couple of thoughts about this quotation. One, to criticize it, he assumes that Muhammad is the author of the Quran. And so that's a certain Orientalist perspective. Others hold that the composition of the Quran is more complicated and includes editing and redaction. So I'll stay away from that kind of language that Hirschfeld uses. But his principal argument, namely that there was biblical language among the people, I think is important and will be verified or vindicated by some of the observations I'll make today about the biblical turns of phrase. Okay, so ready? We're going to do 10 biblical turns of phrase starting now. All right, number one is a very famous quotation found in the three synoptic gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which has to do with the camel and the eye of the needle. I'm going to start with the lower quotation, which is from the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament of the Bible. There, Jesus says to his disciples, "It is hard for someone to enter the kingdom of heaven. Yes, I tell you again, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for someone rich to enter the kingdom of heaven." So when Jesus, at least as Jesus is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew, uses this expression of a camel in the eye of a needle, he is referring to the difficulty of a rich person entering into heaven. There is a whole library of scholarship on this expression and different theories about, is it actually a needle? Was he speaking about something else? I'm going to set that all aside and simply note that the Quran uses this turn of phrase in its seventh surah, Al-Araf, here in the quotation up above. Indeed, those who deny our signs, that is God's signs, and are disdainful of them, the gates of heaven will not be open for them, nor shall they enter paradise until the camel passes through the needles. And you have the Arabic there as well. It's interesting to note that this is clearly the biblical turn of phrase from the Gospels, but used to a new purpose. So no longer is this about a rich person who, because of his or her riches, is not able to enter easily into heaven, but it's rather applied to a major Qur'anic theme, which is those who deny God's signs. And the way that it's phrased, of course, is a bit different as well. But nevertheless, the core of the phrase is there, the camel and the eye of the needle. It's interesting to note that, as I sort of alluded to, there are traditions in the biblical tradition or the tradition of biblical exegesis or commentary, which sort of resisted the idea that this could really be about a camel. Others resist that it really is about the eye of a needle. But there are already in patristic, that is early Christian commentary on the Bible, you have the theory out there that what Jesus was really talking about was not camelos in Greek, but kamilos, which doesn't mean camel, but rather means a thick rope. I believe it's defined by the church fathers specifically as the kind of thick rope that sailors use, that was used in seafaring. And so, I mean, that was meant to, I guess, make the phrase seem less shocking or ridiculous or impossible. But there's a very similar tradition that happens either coincidentally or not. Maybe someone in the comments can give their opinion on whether this parallel development is just a coincidence, or rather there was some influence one way or the other. Namely that the Arabic word for camel can be read according to a variant reading as jummal, and that's really just something that's clumped up together, jummal, but can be applied and mean a thick rope, just as in the variant found in the Greek tradition. Okay, that's kind of a tangent, but I thought it was interesting to note that parallel tradition. Biblical turn of phrase in the Qur'an, number 2, is an allusion to uncircumcised hearts. So this is from Surah Al-Baqarah, Qur'an chapter or Surah 2. It's not the only place it appears. We're going to see a second occurrence of this, but there towards the bottom of the quotation, the Israelites are made to say, our hearts are uncircumcised. Qulubana ghulf. It's actually a variant to this, which is qulubana ghuluf, which means instead that our hearts are containers or envelopes, something like that. But we're just going to stick with the standard reading that you find in the 1924 Cairo edition of the Qur'an, according to Hafs, which is qulubana ghulf, our hearts are uncircumcised. Now, probably what the Qur'an means by that is simply our hearts are covered, and I'll let you think of the visual connection there. It probably just means our hearts are uncovered, but literally it means our hearts are uncircumcised. Very interesting that this is attributed to the Israelites, which kind of, for me, seals the deal that this is, again, picking up a biblical turn of phrase. There we have it again in Qur'an, An-Nisa, Qur'an 4, 155, our hearts are uncircumcised, because in the Old Testament, the Israelites themselves are alluded to as having uncircumcised hearts. Look, Jeremiah chapter 9, the second quotation here is very profound and provocative. For all those nations and the whole house of Israel too are uncircumcised at heart. So this was a way that the Jewish authors of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible called on the Jewish audience to reform itself in an interior manner. You might be circumcised according to the flesh, but are you circumcised according to the heart or the spirit? And this is picked up in the New Testament as well. Here we have the letter to the Romans by Paul, in which he says very explicitly, again, picking up on the language that we saw in Jeremiah, being a Jew is not only having the outward appearance of a Jew, and circumcision is not only a visible physical operation. The real Jew is the one who is inwardly a Jew, and real circumcision is in the heart. So there's that phrase. And then very profoundly here and dramatically, we see it again in the Acts of the Apostles in a speech of Stephen. 1 second. Where Stephen, speaking in front of the Sanhedrin, Stephen celebrated in the Acts of the Apostles as the first Christian martyr. He again connects uncircumcision of the heart with Israel specifically. And here sort of he, after giving sort of a history of Israel and Israel's relationship with God, he speaks to the Sanhedrin, the Israelites in front of him. You are always resisting the Holy Spirit, etc., etc. But at the very beginning, he says, you stubborn people with uncircumcised hearts and ears. So there is that phrase again. In fact, I just point out that this bit in Stephen's speech in Acts 7 seems to be connected in 3 separate ways with the second occurrence of the phrase uncircumcised hearts in the Qur'an, which is found in An-Nisa, Qur'an Surah 4. So there you find then, because of their breaking their covenant, their defiance, of Allah's signs, their killing of the prophets, and again, they're saying our hearts are uncircumcised. And not in the same order, but in Acts, we find the same three, more or less, accusations made against the Israelites: uncircumcised hearts, killing the prophets, and not keeping the law, which is more or less breaking the covenant. So interesting, there seems to be some direct connection between these two passages. So the key point here is that the connection with the Israelites seems to show that we're really speaking about uncircumcised hearts in the Qur'an. But of course, the Qur'an does not really play with the question of circumcision of the flesh versus circumcision of the heart, as Jeremiah and Paul does. Instead, it simply has the Israelites sort of speak of their covered hearts as a way of highlighting, for the Qur'an's purpose, or in the Qur'an's perspective, the stubbornness of the Israelites who refused to listen to the prophet's message. Okay, I just want to point, before going on to turn to phrase number 3, point out that this remained in late antiquity, so much closer to the Qur'an's time and place, or at least time, a major sort of motif or topos that Christian fathers liked to use in their anti-Jewish writings. So the Syriac fathers, the Syriac, again, is a Semitic language that was used in all of late antiquity, so the early centuries of Christianity, and then all the way up to the present day, but was especially prominent and widespread at the time of the Qur'an's origins in the early 7th century. This language among the Syriac fathers includes the use of allusions to the circumcision of the heart in order to make arguments against the Israelites who, at least in some of the rhetoric that's used by the Syriac fathers, boasted in the circumcision of their flesh, but didn't have circumcision of the heart. There you have the Iranian or Persian Syriac father Afrahat, and then the most famous of them all, of the Syriac fathers, Ephraim, or Saint Ephraim, who says, ask yourself, you fool, about the observance of the law. What can circumcision do for sin that lies within? Sin lies inside the heart, and you circumcise your foreskin. So this sort of anti-Israelite rhetoric being used in the Qur'an is found with the Syriac fathers already, and of course ultimately comes from the Bible, not only Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, but also the prophets like Jeremiah. Okay, biblical turn of phrase number 3. The mustard seed in the Synoptic Gospels, there again we find Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus is made to compare the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed. Very nice passage here. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the biggest of shrubs and becomes a tree. Okay, so something very small is made, is exemplified by a mustard seed, which of course is very small. I've given the Syriac there. Of course, the Synoptic Gospels, according to most scholars, although there's a sub-community of people that see them having Aramaic origins, but according to almost all scholars, were written initially in Greek, but they were translated into Syriac very early, long before the Qur'an, in a version known as a Peshitta, also some other versions, but you're going to see why I include the Syriac there in a moment. Again, here is another, excuse me, here is another use of mustard seed in the Gospel of Matthew, where it's not used to compare to the kingdom of heaven, but rather to the power of just a little bit of faith, again, with the mustard seed. And sure enough, in the Qur'an, we find the phrase mustard seed used twice in Qur'an 21, Qur'an 31. And if we look at the Arabic in Qur'an, well, in both cases, but in Qur'an 21, I've put it there in Arabic, khardal. And if I just go back to the previous slide, you'll see hardla is the cognate Syriac term. So we're dealing with the same cognate term. Probably not a very important point, but just thought I'd note that. A more important point is that the use of mustard seed is distinct in the Qur'an. So here the mustard seed again is used because it represents something very small, which presumably seals the deal in connecting the use of mustard seed between the Qur'an and the New Testament. So that's good. But the way the Quran uses mustard seed here is to speak of the microscopic reach of divine justice, that God can see everything. We shall produce it in Quran 21. Quran 31, it's used by the sage Luqman speaking to his son. And once again, he speaks as God speaks in Quran 21. Now Luqman is speaking that way about God. In Quran 31, he says to his son, however small it is, even if it's as small or the weight of a mustard seed, Allah or God will produce it. Okay, that's number 3. And on to number 4. Okay, twinkling of an eye. This is not my strongest example, I'll confess, I'll admit. I'm not 100% convinced that this is a true biblical turn of phrase in the Quran, but I'll put it out there just in case, and you can respond in the comment section if you agree or disagree. There's this nice phrase in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to Corinthians, in which he speaks of eschatology, that is what will happen at the end of our lives or at the end of the world. And he speaks of everything will happen very quickly. And the expression he uses in Greek for very quickly is en ripe ophthalmou. And in Syriac, it's rafaf aina. Both of these basically mean the blinking of an eye. But I think King James, it's from the King James version, that everyone in most Bible translations like to speak of twinkling of an eye. Again, someone can help me if I've gotten something off there in the comment section. But we find in Quran 16 the phrase lamhil basar, used also for the eschaton, so for the last moment or the hour. And that's what makes me think there's probably a connection here, that something will happen as quick as lamhil basar, which is like something happening as quick as en ripe ophthalmou or rafaf aina. Nevertheless, just to note, the Arabic lamh al-basar does not really mean twinkling. It doesn't even mean blinking, if we're to use a more literal rendition of Paul's turn of phrase there. But it means a quick glance, probably. So maybe it just seems similar, but it's not similar. I'll let people offer their own opinions on that. Okay, on to maybe a strange one. Many viewers perhaps would have been familiar with some of the examples that I've given thus far for biblical turns of phrase. But look what you find in Quran 49. Do not spy on one another or backbite. Will any of you love to eat the flesh of his dead brother? يَأْكُلُ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيْتًا. You would hate it. So that's an interesting expression and a way of alluding to spying or backbiting, betraying someone, speaking bad about someone outside of their presence. Something like that is equivalent to eating the dead flesh of one's brother. Where could that come from? Why would the Quran use this turn of phrase? Well, it's possible it comes from Galatians. So GAL, there's an abbreviation for Paul's letter to the Galatians, where you can read through the bit there, where it speaks of the law being fulfilled in loving the love of a neighbor. And then Paul goes on and says, but if you bite and devour, and in the Syriac translation, notably, the cognate of yetkula, which is klitun, is used. So, but if you bite and eat one another, take heed that you are not consumed by one another. So I think this is pretty close. I think this is probably a true biblical turn of phrase picked up in the Quran. On to number 6. This is an intriguing one. 70 times, the 6th biblical turn of phrase in the Quran. Out of the 10 I'm highlighting, but that's not comprehensive. Okay, so in Surah At-Tawbah, Quran 9, we have God reprimanding, maybe, I don't know if someone might feel that that's too strong language, but God sort of counseling or advising the prophet, and God says to him, the you there is in italics because it's second person singular, whether you plead forgiveness for them or do not plead forgiveness for them, even if you plead forgiveness for them 70 times, Allah will never forgive them because they defied Allah and His apostle, etc. Okay, why 70? That's the question. Why does the Quran say 70 times? Why not 60 or 80 or 100 or 1,000? It's obviously using a number which symbolically represents many times, but why 70? 70 does occur, I think, in two other places in the Quran. I think like there's a chain in hell which is called 70 cubits or something long. I think a number of something, there's a bit on the history of the Israelites in the number of someone somewhere in the story of the Israelites in the Quran is said to be 70. Someone in the comments, help me. But so you could just say, well, the Quran just likes 70. I think that's a coherent argument, but look at this. When Peter asks Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Should I do it 7 times? Jesus responds, no, 70. Sorry, I've got this persistent cough. 1 second. Jesus responds, no, 70 times 7. Now, in both cases, it's about forgiveness, which to me makes the link pretty compelling that the Quran is using this biblical turn of phrase when it's addressing forgiveness. But obviously, it does it in a different way. For Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, or his counsel to Peter, he's counseling Peter by saying, you need to forgive someone 70 times 7 times. And obviously, in the Quran, it has to do with forgiveness, but it's even if you ask 70 times for the forgiveness, God will not forgive the unbelievers. The Quran is using this 70 in a different way, but on the topic of forgiveness, which suggests that it is connected to the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, on to another eschatological image. We had one before, and now we're speaking about the way in which the Quran describes the heavens sort of being terminated in the last day. In Quran 21, we read that the day we shall roll up the heaven like rolling of the scrolls, sijil. A lot to be said about sijil. I believe it's related to a Greek term, and I believe it's properly understood as scrolls. We will bring it back just as we began the first creation, etc., etc. And then look at this. We find that in eschatological image in both the Old Testament Hebrew Bible in Isaiah and in the very last book of the Christian New Testament, the book of Revelation, presumably drawing on Isaiah, we find allusions to the heavens or the sky being rolled up like a scroll. Now, the Greek and Syriac, just the actual word there in Revelation is just book, but that it's said to be rolled up suggests that this is a book or a writing, which is in fact a scroll. So I think the translation there is correct. This is a pretty close correspondence between the image there and the way the image is used, which is exceptional. I'm going to get back to this point. But in most cases, note, so far, we have seen that the Quran uses this biblical turn of phrase in a new or different way. Here, it's in a pretty similar way. Okay, here we have another example from Paul's letters about in this case, a different topic. It's intriguing that Paul's letters are alluded to in the Quran. So look at this in Quran 32, verse 17. No soul knows what comfort is laid up for them secretly as a recompense for what they were doing. I suggest, and I'm not the first to do so, that this is connected to 1 Corinthians 2:9. Again, Paul, where he says, as it is written, what no eye has seen, no ear heard, nor the heart of man conceive what God has prepared for those who love him. Very intriguing. The correspondence is not exact, but similar to the previous example. Here, the Quran is doing something very similar that the Bible is doing, or Paul in 1 Corinthians, namely using a turn of phrase about people not knowing the nature of God's reward in heaven. that this is sort of mysterious. But in both cases, it's about reward in heaven. And there's this affirmation that no one can truly know, and it's implied how glorious, how wonderful, how pleasant the reward is in heaven. Just want to note that there is a Hadith Qudsi. Many will know that Hadith Qudsi is a declaration of God in Islamic tradition, not in the Qur'an, but preserved in Hadith collections. So it's most Hadith are either an eyewitness reporting most Hadith are an eyewitness reporting either what Muhammad has said or Muhammad has done. But the Hadith Qudsi is a special genre, which is a divine declaration, but not in the Quran, preserved in Hadith collections. Anyway, there's a Hadith Qudsi, which follows 1 Corinthians 2:9 much more closely, which seems, in fact, to almost verbatim repeat 1 Corinthians. There's a good article that's been written about this. I just note, this is really a side note, not on the topic of the biblical turns of phrase in the Quran, but you'll see that 1 Corinthians says, as it is written, and biblical scholars have a big debate about what is actually being quoted here. There's some Old Testament material which is sort of close. Others think maybe Paul is not alluding to an earlier version of the saying in the Old Testament, but somewhere else. Okay, on we go. Example number 9. This is pretty important because here we have an example in the biblical turn of phrase, which is found in the Old Testament and not in the New Testament. It is our first, and I think only example of the 10 I've chosen, and I think it's representative generally. I haven't sort of stacked the deck here this is our only example of an Old Testament only biblical turn of phrase. So just to explain it, here in Quran, Al-Baqarah, verse 93, so Surah 2, verse 93, again, the Israelites are quoted and alluded to here, and sort of polemically, they are made to say to God, when God commands them to obey, more or less, they say, we hear and disobey. Sami'na wa asayna. So there you have it. Very, very intriguingly, again, I'm not the first to notice this. Many scholars, early Orientalists, have spoken about this for a long time. It's been a part of tradition in studies on Quran and the Bible, but nevertheless, it's still interesting. In the Pentateuch, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 27. So Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and of course, the Christian Bible. Here, the Israelites affirm that they will obey. But look at the Hebrew. This is quotation of Hebrew in the second quotation here. The Hebrew which affirms that they will obey, down here, the Hebrew says, Shemanu wa asinu. Now, what I really want to point out is that the Arabic asena sounds an awful lot like asinu. They're not actually cognates. They're actually different roots because the S is different on each case. But there's a assonance, or there's a sort of substantial similarity in these two words, at least phonologically, in the sound of the two words. But the meaning is completely reversed. So now the Israelites who in Deuteronomy affirm, we have heard and we will do, which put into practice, we will obey, the Quran seems to play with the Hebrew and use an Arabic word that sounds like the Hebrew word to make the Israelites say, we have heard and we disobey. So interesting example. Okay, one last one, which is kind of a turn of phrase and potentially maybe, I would say probably no, but some would say yes, an actual quotation of a biblical verse. This is the last one, the 10th biblical turn of phrase in the Quran. So in Quran 21, verse 105, we find, certainly we wrote in the Psalm, Zabur, after the remembrance, my righteous servants shall indeed inherit the earth. Again, many people have noticed this before me, so I'm just sort of bringing together what earlier scholars have already written about into one YouTube video. But this is intriguing because there is a statement, in fact, in the Psalms, and the Quran alludes to Zabur, the Psalms, which in verse 9 of Psalm 37 shall have the land for their own. And then in verse 29, of the same psalm, but the upright shall have a land for their own. So the Quran seems to, in a very unusual, in fact, probably singular occurrence, refer to the name of the biblical book in quote material from this biblical book. It's not a precise quotation. That's why I hesitate, because it uses this Quranic language, my righteous servants. I believe it's ibadi salihun there. So it's really more of a turn of phrase, which is inherit the earth, more or less. And probably the Quranic translation there is affected by Bible translations like the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, which use the language inherit the land or inherit the earth. So I just thought I'd notice that it's not 100% sure that this is coming right from the Psalms. I mean, it does refer to the Psalms, but I just note at least that I believe this is in the Beatitudes. Jesus is made in the Gospel of Matthew to speak of inheriting the earth as well. Okay, friends, we're on to the final slide and the two conclusions. So this is sort of what all of this was leading up to. What do we notice when we study biblical turns of phrase in the Qur'an? Well, first, we notice that the Qur'an uses these turns of phrase in a new or original fashion. So the Qur'an is not borrowing large material from the Bible. The Qur'an is taking short turns of phrase and applying them to a new teaching. So, for example, the camel and the eye of the needle is now applied to people who deny God's signs. This probably indicates that the biblical material was among the people, was in the air, was in everyday discourse in the Qur'an's context, that this would be a way that the Qur'an could use a recognizable turn of phrase effectively for the sake of its own teaching. Hopefully it's clear what I'm saying, that this points to a historical social context in which biblical language was being used, probably in everyday speech. Two, most turns of phrase that we've studied in this little short episode have been from the New Testament. So that's really interesting. 9 out of 10, even though the New Testament is much, 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 much shorter than the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 9 of the 10 are either only in the New Testament or both in the Old and in the New Testament. Okay, so that's interesting already. Does this suggest that despite the tradition that there were Jews in Medina but Christians nowhere, more or less, in the Quran's context, does this suggest that, in fact, there were more Christians than are commonly assumed to have been in the Quran's original milieu? Very intriguing. Okay, and just a final point there is to note that the Quran uses turns of phrase that we've seen, a couple of them, from Paul's letters, even though the Quran sort of doctrinally or dogmatically never refers to Paul. And of course, Islamic tradition generally rejects Paul as in authentic authority on the teaching of Jesus. But the Quran seems to be using Paul's turns of phrase in a number of these examples that I've given, which might suggest that those turns of phrase were simply circulating among, presumably, Christians in the Quran's original context, so that the Quran is simply channeling the sorts of turns of phrase that were popular in the historical and social milieu of the Quran's emergence. Thank you for your patience with me. I look forward to your comments on this video. Thank you so much for being here and exploring the Quran and the Bible. I will be so grateful if you like this video, subscribe and share. More resources are found in this book, The Quran and the Bible, published by Yale University Press, which you can find at that big online book site and other places as well. Very grateful for the time you spent here. See you next time.